Contributing to open source is not just for your side projects or your community work. You know, I always say contributing to open source will get you the job that you want. It is all about collaboration first, code second. Organizations are using open source software more and more for their projects, as well as contributing to open source. I see this in my clients and even at the events that I speak at. In this video, I'm going to talk about the results of a 2021 survey carried out by VMware Tanzu called the State of Software Supply Chain Open Source Edition 2021. Keep watching to find out why your next employer or client is using open source, the challenges they face, and how you can become part of the solution. And that is what we are here to do as engineers, solve problems, not use the latest buzzwords or shiny technology, although that can be fun as well. We all know open source is taking over the world, one pull request at a time. There is an open source project for almost everything. Take the open source project curl, for example. I'm pretty sure you've heard of it, and I'm pretty sure you've used it. It is used from the command line to kitchen mixers to NASA's Mars helicopter. It is a safe assumption that almost all organizations around the world are running at least some open source software. It could be from running Linux as a server, Nginx as a load balancer, or React as a front end. In some areas, using open source software is the only option. Why do you think this is? It might be that there's no proprietary software available to achieve your objectives, or from my experience, paid software has to go through procurement, which can take many months and therefore affect the project timeline and the team motivation. Whereas open source is readily available and transparent. Open source has so many benefits from the technical side, but also the hiring and retaining employees. People want to work for companies using open source technologies as these skills are more transferable. If, in addition to using open source software, the organization also has open source projects or contributes back to the open source community, then this makes them even more desirable as an employer. It demonstrates that the organization is committed to keep on learning the latest best practices and technologies, but also contributing to the wider community and giving their team the opportunity to have a voice. Who would not want to work for an organization where you can keep learning and building your own personal brand? The report's first section looks at the open source momentum. Let me ask you a question. What percentage of organizations do you think use open source in production? 25%? 50%? 90%? I think you'll get this one right. 95% of companies who took part in the survey use open source software. Are you surprised? I'm not. The findings of the report show that larger organizations with more than 1,000 developers are more likely to use community editions of open source projects. Smaller companies tend to use the commercially supported open source products as they are less likely to have the resources to deal with any challenges and are looking for their open source software to come with expert support. The survey found that the most popular categories of open source software are, in first place, operating systems with 83%, just behind our runtimes of 79%, and following closely behind our databases and caches at 75%. This is something I would expect to see with most web servers running Linux and most popular languages and databases being open source. My next question for you, which I think you will get wrong, I know I did, is what percentage of organizations manage production and development environments differently? Let me give you a moment to think about it. And actually, while you're thinking about it, add a comment below to what you think the percentage is. This percentage was a staggering 78%. I was shocked to hear this as I thought it would be closer to 10 to 20%. I have spent the last 15 years trying to get development and production aligned as much as possible for my clients. For me, aligning all the environments, for example, development, testing, production, and everything else in between, is a huge benefit, so there are no surprises along the pipeline. You have heard the expression, "It works on my computer." People also use, "It works fine in development." The further you reach down the pipeline, the more difficult it is to debug and fix issues. And this is why the tech community strive to have the same environment all the way from development to production. As I'm sure you all agree, development should be as secure as production. Having different security policies for development and production is like playing the lottery as to whether the project will work in the next stage of the environment. I want to highlight that any differences in any of the environments will increase the risk of surprises further down the pipeline, which cannot be replicated in development, making these very hard to solve. It is possible to achieve this. For example, one of my clients, FinTech, where not only the development was production ready, but also every PR, every pull request was built into a production-like environment. And then once the PR was merged, the production-like environment would be torn down. Let that sink in for a moment. Not only the development environment, but every PR was built into a production-like environment. With today's tools, this should not be a surprise or difficult to achieve. The report also looks at whether companies feel that benefits of using open source software outweigh the challenges. Open source tools release more frequently and are compatible with popular standards. Therefore, value can be achieved sooner with access to these technologies directly from GitHub itself or from popular package managers, each with access to the latest changes, which reduces the risk of surprises and big bang releases. It is also possible to collaborate with the community and the maintainers on features, suggestions, and bug fixes, bridging the gap between the consumer using open source software and the authors, as opposed to commercial software where you're speaking to layers and layers above the engineering team. Overall, the report findings show that the main benefit of using open source software are reduced costs for 79%, more flexibility for 63%, and benefit from a huge community was important to 58%. And it does not surprise me that according to the report, 36% of stakeholders have licensing concerns. Licensing is often misunderstood by the person using the project and also sometimes by the maintainers themselves. Overall, however, companies felt that the benefit of using open source software in production outweighs the concerns they have. The third section of the report looks at packaging and how it remains challenging and complex. In this video, I'm going to define packaging in the same way that the report does. The process of adapting open source software so it can be used by the organization in their projects. Half of those who took part say that packaging open source software has more steps and checks and verifications than commercial software. In open source, it is great that we can rely on so many dependencies, as this allows us to focus on our business logic in our own projects. The downside of this is we do not just include, say, 10 dependencies that our project needs, we also include multiple dependencies for each of their dependencies and each of their own dependencies, and so on. You get the picture. Therefore, it is very difficult to track vulnerabilities, as 52% indicated, as well as there being challenges when checking whether dependencies are compliant, which is also a concern for 51% of the respondents. Currently, as there is no one tool to achieve deployment of an app from code to user, it is understandable that 70% of companies that participated in the survey use multiple tools to accomplish the job. For example, in GitHub, we use one GitHub action to build a Docker container and another GitHub action to deploy to our Kubernetes cluster. And this is quite a simplified environment as we're using a managed Kubernetes service. However, in many other organizations, they will want to manage this themselves and will need additional tools such as HashiCorp's Terraform. Prior to packaging and deploying, there are many tasks which need to run and be successful. Can you guess what those are? You hear me talk about these all the time in my YouTube videos, and we use them in GitHub projects. For example, like linting, functional testing, load testing, accessibility testing, and taking a release. These are vital for any project, big or small, to ensure quality and consistency. So it is no surprise to see from the report, functional testing and load testing were the most popular tasks performed before releasing. 65% of organizations have more than one team responsible for packaging open source software. Some have as many as 5 teams involved. From my experience, the more traditional organizations have around 3 teams: development, testing, and ops. This long feedback cycle has the potential to get even longer if any issues are found further down the pipeline. For example, if this process takes 1 month, and should a bug or security issue be found, the process will take longer than 3 months, as well as adding complexity to the release cycle. The final section of the report looks at software supply chain risks. Open source software is considered to be one of the most secure because of its transparency and rapid iterations. However, the survey showed that 94% have concerns about security of open source software in production. Respondents felt that there is no guarantee that vulnerabilities will be fixed. However, From my experience, vulnerabilities are typically fixed as a matter of high priority by the community. In my opinion, these vulnerabilities arise because people do not update the dependencies often enough in their own projects. Also, time is not allocated for this during the team's sprint. Then as dependency versions race ahead, it becomes even more difficult to upgrade, and higher risk migrations are required. There are automated tools for this that even submit a PR, kicking off all the automated checks. But still, this is seen as a low priority. From the report, ownership of security is unclear, with almost 1 in 10 saying there is no single owner. Responsibility tends to rest with the security team, and 47% of companies who took the survey agree with this. However, as running pen testing is usually done at the end of the pipeline just before release to production, this is always too late. Any changes would have to go back to the beginning of the pipeline and repeat the whole process. This is costly and time-consuming and often forgotten. This is like adding the finishing touches to a car, then checking if the brakes work afterwards. In my view, the area of security should be a combined effort between the different teams, similar to DevOps. There are various tools like OWASP SAP, which can be added to the build pipeline to facilitate bridging the gap between the security team and the development team, which can highlight high, medium, and low items which can be used for regular discussions and planned into each team's sprint. The report concludes that about half of the companies that participate in the survey are concerned about being dependent on the open source software community for patches and bug fixes, and also believe that the use of open source software introduces security risks. Having commercial support available for quick and professional answers can be reassuring. However, this is likely to be within business hours and in the time zone of the company providing the support. Whereas with the community, contributors are spread out all over the world and exposed to different scenarios, therefore increasing the likelihood that someone will have encountered the same problem that you're facing. This is why I keep encouraging you all to get into open source, as this will make you more attractive to companies and clients. This is a great way to get headhunted by companies looking for people not only have experience in these technologies, but also who are great problem solvers. What are you waiting for? Get involved in open source today, and remember, it's not just about code, but also about collaboration. If you want to read VMware Tanzu's full report, then I have linked this in the description below. To me, it was super useful to go through this report and find out what companies think about open source software in 2021, as it helps me bridge the gap between the community and organizations so that we can make open source even better in 2022. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe below for more content on open source, web dev, freelancing, and digital nomad.